So I think I can get started at this stage. I don't think there's anybody in the waiting room. My name is Shana O'Rian. I'm a chair and a speaker for this session on how COVID-19 crisis both challenges and provides opportunities for Ireland's small open economy model. And I suppose the other side of that is how the small open economy model provides opportunities and challenges in responding to the COVID-19 crisis. So I want to thank you all for attending. I'm sure people will be dipping in and out. A lot of you will have been at the first session. We were kind of getting set up for this, so we didn't really have the benefit of those discussions. So there might be interesting crossovers across the sessions that you would be more aware of than we might. I just want to thank, to start off with, the Geary Institute, Philip O'Connell, Orla Doyle, Stephen Kinsella and Liam Delaney for putting all this together at short notice. Philip is helping us out with on the technical side here, and also Susan Butler doing great work, and we had great help from Mark Hargett during the week as well. So thanks to everybody for being involved. I don't anticipate technological problems. Any technological problems that there are, I suspect, will be down to my lack of skills. So I will apologize in advance, and we'll do our best to try and work through those if they come up. Our format is 3 speakers, 15 minutes each or so, and then questions and answers for, I would hope, at least half an hour. We will have the video and the mic on for the speakers when they're speaking, and then we'll all join in at the end. We'll do the questions and answers session, comments and discussion after the end of the 3 speakers. Your main point of interaction is through the chat. I'm going to try and keep an eye on questions and comments that come in throughout the session. So if you have a question in the middle of David's presentation, for example, it's fine to put it into the chat. And what I'll try and do is kind of aggregate them by theme and so on. It's better to send it to me as the chair than to send it to the speaker, because that way I can see them all, and there may be an overlap, and also the speaker may miss them in the chat as they're speaking. I think that's the logistics to start off with. I just wanted to give a brief introduction to the speakers. I noticed bizarrely that I've actually written notes here about myself, which I'm not quite sure why I did that, but the first speaker will be Dr. David Skilling. David is the founding director of the Landfall strategy group based in the Netherlands, but doing a huge amount of international work on small advanced economies. You may well have heard him at a conference on Ireland on small open economies in the Department of Foreign Affairs, probably 2018 now at this stage. He's been a senior advisor to the Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade in New Zealand, worked for McKinsey for a number of years, was founding chief executive of the New Zealand Institute, and started all that off with all this international work with a PhD in public policy from Harvard University. After that, I'll speak I'm a professor of sociology at Maynooth. I have an interest in economic development and inequality, particularly with regard to the changing nature of work, post-industrial economies and so on. And I've written about Indigenous enterprise and enterprise policy and the Irish kind of social model. And then the final speaker will be Shana Cohen. Shana is the director of TASC, the think tank for action and social change here in Dublin. She is labelled here as John White, but actually is Shana Cohen. That's just a technical issue. She has a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, where she studied the political and social consequences of marketization in Morocco. She's done a huge amount of work with NGOs, with states. She did consulting for the World Bank, the Grameen Bank, and she's still an affiliated lecturer and associate researcher at the University of Cambridge, where she was the deputy director of the Wolf Institute. So I think we have a lot of international experience, and that gives you a sense of the range that the speakers are bringing to the discussion. But without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to David Skilling for our first presentation. Okay. And also, I suppose if you have any technical issues as you go along, or any queries you want to alert me to anything, feel free to send me a message in the chat and I will do my best to address them. Okay. Okay, David, I'll hand it over to you. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Sean, and good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to offer 15 minutes or so of remarks on the small economy model, drawing on the international experience, but applying it to the Irish context this morning. I don't have any slides to accompany my remarks like the other presenters. I didn't trust my facility with the technology. But for those who are interested, I write a lot on the topics that I'm going to cover this morning. So on my Twitter feed, on my website, and so on. There are a few key themes that I would like to address in my remarks. The first is just to define terms. What do we actually mean by the small economy model, and to what extent is Ireland, kind of characteristic, if you like, of the small economy model? The second aspect is looking more directly at COVID-19. So what is the impact that coronavirus is having on small economies? What are the challenges, what are the responses that we see happening around the world and also in Ireland? And then thirdly, what does this imply for the policy approach of small open economies going forward? To what extent do they need to do things differently? To what extent does it mean continuing to move in the direction that they have been? So those are the three themes that I'm going to use to structure my remarks. So to start, what do we actually mean by the small economy model? Well, the first element, I suppose, is quite obvious. Small economies are open economies. They have high export shares of GDP, high inward and outward direct investment flows. Commonly, those are 2 or 3 times the shares of GDP that you'll see in larger economies, and are the growth engines, oftentimes, of small economies. You'll also see commonly significant cross-border flows of people as well. So small economies are open economies. But small economies are more than simply the kind of the passive recipients of global dynamics. They don't simply rise and fall as globalization rises and falls. One of the reasons that small economies have been successful is they've had an ability to position themselves for success in that environment. And although there's no single small economy archetype, there are some common themes when you look around the world at small economies that enable us to kind of put some structure around what our small economy model actually is. So just to give you a flavor of what those common themes, those common factors are, firstly around policy settings, and there are a few things here in no particular order of importance. One, they tend to be reasonably fiscally conservative, at least in terms of fiscal balance. They try not to accumulate significant amounts of debt, thereby creating exposures. But the flip side of that is commonly you see government spending levels as a share of GDP being quite high in small economies. So this is perhaps most commonly associated with Northern European economies with fairly generous social insurance systems, to compensate for the high level of volatility these economies have because of their openness. They tend to have fairly high levels of government spending or other forms of social insurance. They perform well in terms of labour markets. They tend to have a system that is able to get people into productive employment reasonably well. And they also make high levels of investment in skills and in innovation. So R&D spending, for example, tends to be high, both in business and across the economy in small economies. And so, on individual policy settings, there are some common factors that you see across high-performing small economies. And more broadly than that, one of the kind of qualitative features, I suppose, is that small economies, in the way that they think about themselves, the way they think about their policy approaches, tend to have a sense of a need to position themselves deliberately. So Ireland is an obvious case here. It has a very clear strategy around taxes, human capital, inward FDI. But various other small economies have a sort of similar features. They have a very clear sense of how they kind of package these various sort of policies together in a way that enables them to compete successfully in global markets. And all of that is underpinned by strong state capacity, effective governance, strong political institutions, strong social institutions on measures of social capital and social trust. So this is very much not a minimal state laissez-faire model. Small economies understand the importance of effective government and of the need for governments to work effectively with other stakeholders to position their economies successfully. And in those regards, when Ireland ticks many of those boxes in terms of being an archetypal, if you like, small open economy. In general terms, this is a model that has worked very well, particularly over the last few decades of very intense globalization. Ireland has positioned itself well. Clearly there have been significant bumps along the way, most notably, of course, the financial crisis a decade or so ago. But in general, small economies, including Ireland, but in Europe, in the Asia Pacific and the like, in the Middle East, have done well in terms of a range of economic and social outcomes. GDP growth rates have been strong, employment rates have been strong, on measures of inclusive growth, on innovation, of competitiveness. Small economies have done well, and as many of you, I'm sure, will appreciate, any time another global ranking is released, be it by the World Economic Forum or the United Nations or what have you, small economies tend to dominate those models. They are, at the same time, a more turbulent, more volatile group of economies. They are more exposed to shocks, both domestic and external. And as a consequence, have had to figure out through bitter experience many times how they adapt and how they build resilience into their economies. And this theme of resilience is one I'll come back to a little bit later in my remarks, and I think the other speakers will also. Now, clearly, there are some challenges to the environment in which small economies have prospered over the last period of time. There are threats around globalization, there's geopolitical tensions, and so there's been a bunch of commentary over the last few years in particular about, is the small economy model over? Was it just a sort of a freakish circumstance, if you like, that small economies have done well over the last few decades, but we're now moving into a different environment in which that will no longer be the case? I am somewhat optimistic. If you look at many of the characteristics that have supported small economy growth over the last few decades, particularly around strong institutions, strong policy-making capacity, and many of the specific policy settings that they have, will stand them in good stead going forward. So I think the rumours of the death of the small economy model are much exaggerated, which is in a sense particularly good news as I move to the second element of my remarks, and we think more specifically about coronavirus, because obviously this is a very major shock in public health terms for countries and for the world. Obviously also a very significant global economic shock, and one to which small economies, by virtue of their openness, are going to be deeply exposed. And we already see, looking around the world, from Singapore and Taiwan through to Northern Europe, that coronavirus, both in a public health sense, but also in an economic sense, is having a material impact on small economies. Infection rates and unfortunately death rates have been very high on a per capita basis in several smaller countries, from Switzerland to the Netherlands, where I'm sitting at the moment. But the flip side of that, and the good news, I suppose, is that the quality of the public health response and also the economic policy response in many of these small economies has been very, very good indeed. My original home country, New Zealand, is often lauded for getting cases down to single-digit levels in terms of the number of new cases a day. But also you look at the Taiwans, the Hong Kongs, several European countries that are beginning to reopen their economies. The policy response has been good, and that's very much based on strong state capacity, these strong institutions. But that said, coronavirus and what the IMF during the week called the Great Lockdown is going to have a very consequential impact on small economies. The IMF are predicting GDP growth of -3% worldwide this year, which is down from it's down about 6% from where they thought it would be in October of last year. And those downgrades are particularly acute in small economies. And indeed, Ireland, among the group of small economies that I monitor, Ireland was the economy that received the sharpest downgrade. Whereas in October last year, Ireland was picked to grow at 3.5% in 2020. The IMF are now picking about -7% in 2020. So that's sort of a 10% plus downgrade before hopefully a rebound into 2021. But I think that's optimistic. So this is going to be a very sharp shock for small economies, which will manifest in labour markets. It will impact in sort of social outcomes, obviously impact on sort of classic economic outcomes as well, like export growth. And so small economies are going to have to do some quick dancing. As I mentioned a moment ago, there is evidence that they are doing so in terms of the immediate response. And I'd note that the Irish response in terms of the various wage subsidy schemes and financial support has been very good and very fast, and of a type that you see in many other small economies. But in addition to kind of figuring out how do we respond to the immediate crisis of the next 12 or 18 months and beyond, there are also some structural challenges associated with coronavirus that are going to impact on the strategic environment, if you like, in which small economies are operating. And so here I'm thinking about the likelihood of a slow recovery in globalization. So global cross-border flows are going to be off for some time. And even when they do come back, the nature of those flows, I think, is likely to be different. multinational companies are really looking hard at their supply chains, sometimes under political pressure to do so. So we're going to see less of a global economy and more of a collection of regional economies. Obviously Ireland is very exposed to MNC location decisions. This will have an impact for Ireland. Similarly, many small economies, including Ireland, are exposed to international tourism flows, reliant on international migration to supplement the domestic workforce. Those flows also are going to be off, I suspect, for quite some time, and will pose challenges in terms of how do small economies develop additional growth engines to offset those losses? How do they move to an economic model that is less reliant on importing foreign labour? So countries like New Zealand, Singapore, Ireland, really have to think about the nature of the labour-intensive growth models that they have been running. To what extent can they be sustained? And how do they respond to some of the changing political sentiment around the world in terms of particularly larger countries wanting to improve the level of self-sufficiency, if you like, and obtain greater control over their supply chain. So for a world in which we are likely to be moving, and admittedly there is significant uncertainty about what this new normal will look like, but it is going to pose, I think, particular challenges for small economies. That said, I think that small economies can continue to draw on some of their intrinsic capabilities. So I'm not sort of overly negative, but we shouldn't underestimate the magnitude of both the immediate challenge, but also the structural challenge as the nature of globalization, the nature of policy making around the world begins to change. And small countries, if they want to maintain good economic and social outcomes, also need to be thinking about those. Which brings me to the third set of remarks that I'd like to offer before I close. What does this all imply for the policy posture of small economies going forward? Is it the case, as some have been arguing, that the small economy model in some sense is over, it's dead, and that we need to think about doing things very differently going forward? My sense of it is actually the small economy model works. It works economically, it works socially. Yes, there are some clear challenges, as I've just been mentioning, around the shape and nature and intensity of globalization. But I don't think there is a need for an unwinding of the key dimensions of the small economy model that I outlined at the start of my remarks. Small economies really don't have that much of a choice, to be honest, other than to engage in international markets. The domestic markets simply aren't big enough to get the scale and specialization and the growth opportunities that you need. And indeed, I'd say in general terms that aspects of the global policy debate that we see at the moment seem to me similar from a small economy viewpoint. We're talking about a stronger, more deliberate role for the state, something that you see in many small economies around the world. You talk about sort of institutions and resilience and social insurance, again, things that are commonplace in the small economy policy debate. So my view of it is actually the small economy model, I think, will remain intact. Remaining internationally oriented, I think, will remain important. And for small economies, perhaps perversely, that international orientation provides a measure of diversification. It means that you're not simply exposed to the domestic environment, you've got exposure elsewhere as well. So I think that if you like, the core of the small economy model remains intact, but there are, I think, several ways in which the model will need to be strengthened and adapted for this new global context. So I'll just offer a few thoughts here, and obviously very happy to expand on this as we move into time for discussion and questions later. But just a few, and again, in no particular order of importance. Small economies will need to continue to invest in state capacity and resilience. And I think it's no great surprise that if you look around the world, there is a very high correlation between the quality of a response and the outcomes that are being generated, both public health and economic, and the quality of governance in those jurisdictions. So the US perhaps is a classic example of this in terms of a not very good response. Countries like Taiwan, countries like New Zealand, some of the Northern Europeans have done much better. But as the scale of those challenges continues to increase, so the demands on state capacity and on building resilience will also increase. The second dimension, and this we've seen historically as well, every time that there is a significant global economic shock that makes it more difficult to generate growth from global markets, the standard response of small economies is to double down on strengthening their competitive position. Often that will relate to investment in skills, in innovation, in infrastructure, in things that positions you well. And that does require, again, a very deliberate approach. Obviously, there's a firm level dimension to that, but it also involves oftentimes governments taking a very clear view on how they like to position themselves. Also thinking about the regional dimension. Small economies, by definition, are small. They need friends. They won't be able to do this alone. And so I think, particularly in the case of Ireland, having the EU and maintaining a very strong relationship with the EU politically and economically will be critically important. I think Ireland has done a very good job of that, both through the Brexit negotiations, through the Eurozone crisis and the like. And I think that's going to be increasingly important. Not all small countries in the world have the luxury of kind of regional support measures like the EU. So those are just to give you a flavour, some of the things that I think are going to be important for small economies over the next period of time. I do think that the model works. It is one that can remain intact. But I would just perhaps end with a note of caution, which is if the adaptation is not done, or the policy response is poor, and the caveat here, of course, is this is a very, very consequential, once in a generation, or perhaps 2 or 3 generation shock. The risk for things to go wrong is quite high. One of the downsides of being a small open economy is the margin for policy error is quite small. If you make a mistake, the consequences of that become clear very quickly. If you're the US or France, you can do stupid stuff for a long time before it becomes clear. So small economies do face this competitive discipline. And I think, if we look back to the 1970s, where there were also a series of major economic and political shocks, not all countries responded to those well, including small economies. Often there was big import substitution, a lot of sort of distortion into the economy, generating quite poor outcomes. I think the lesson from those experiences in the past is that small economies need to position themselves thoughtfully and well to build resilience, to capture this opportunity, or capture the opportunities that will present themselves. And I think small economies are well placed to do that. Ireland is well placed to do that. And there's a lot that can be learned for Ireland by looking across the other smaller countries and figuring out what are those jurisdictions doing and what can we learn. So in summation, big challenge, but I think small economies, I think Ireland are well positioned, but it is going to be a challenging period of time. So perhaps, Sean, if I finish there, hand back to you. Very happy to take questions later on in the piece.
Great. Thank you very much, David. That was great. And just before I go into my own remarks with some slides, I know some people have joined us since I made my preliminary comments about format and so on. So David Skilling just spoke. I'll speak now, and then Shana Cohen from TASC will speak after me. And then there will be time for 25-30 minutes of questions and answers and discussion at the end. And if you have questions as we go, if you could send them to me on the chat, that I will try and aggregate them and gather them together. Obviously, it's open to you to wait as well. So I'll go into my own comments now. I'm going to try and share a presentation. I think that is working. Let me just, start the slideshow. Okay, sorry, just 1 second. Okay, so my remarks really they build off David's in many ways. They're trying to think through some of the features of small open economies, but also some of the dynamics of, in the broader sense. I'm by no means a public health expert, but maybe some understandings that we have of COVID-19 and coronavirus and how it might develop, but how that links up to the small open economy model and what we may be able to kind of mobilize from that in different ways at different times. So I think we're looking at 3 shocks. Well, many shocks, but obviously the very nasty health shock, and employment and economic shock, which just is illustrated there in the table with the first column. These are some of the big loser sectors in terms of employment. 2012 Q2 is kind of the low point of employment after the financial crisis. Then the most recent quarter that we have stats for the end of last year, a very significant growth in employment over those 7 years. Then the thousands of people in each sector that are on the wage subsidy scheme, and then finally the overall the overall numbers if you take those people out, just as a sense of the initial shock. And you can see even in wholesale and retail, implicitly at least, we're already below the low point of 2012, and based on projections of further employment loss or slowing, some of the other sectors are kind of headed in the same direction. So this is, as you know, a huge economic and social shock. And then finally, and I suppose I'll come back to this later, is a kind of a shock to our sense even of time and space, that our space has become very contracted, but our relationship to the future is highly uncertain, and there's a sense of which I'm trying to think through how we try and work with that and work through that uncertainty. So we might think about some possible futures. These are quite stylized and maybe even caricatured, but in a sense we might, if you think, on the one hand, we're going to try and refloat back to the economy we had in 2019. I don't know if anybody, really thinks that we can do that, but in the same way, but maybe there's a sense that we could go back to a version of the model we had, but with stronger public services. On the other hand, that's going to be very challenging when you look on the other side with this kind of, there's going to be huge issues of debt, there's going to be pressure for cuts and so on, especially when we look at the European level. Who knows how that will work out this time? And there will be some winners out of this, maybe not in the overall, but relative to others. And we're zooming this morning, that's going to be a major factor after this crisis. So who will shape that future? And in a sense, the most worrying scenario, in a sense, is that while there's a huge demand for public services, if there was a policy response which was to cut those, that leaves a gap that really more intensified public and private surveillance might step into. Now, we want to just think about, is there a way that the small open economy model can navigate a way through those? Because in a sense, I suppose the Keynesian model is in a way more, if I can caricature it, that is more attractive, but is also, there are challenges to getting there. So if you think about the small open economy model, what do we have? We have, as David was talking about, I won't go through it in detail, but the openness, the challenges of openness and volatility, but the kind of advantages of smallness with domestic capacities for coordination and so on. The basic kind of dynamic. But crucial to that, managing that dynamic, is the element of social compensation of the welfare state and the labour market, and how it, what is offered by a kind of developed welfare state and protections in the labour market. And in a way, you can think about two different dimensions to that. One, it operates as protection from these international, protection for the population from these kind of international pressures and volatility, which we're facing now in an extreme case, and also forms of investment into the future and building capacity, so that the welfare state not only provides protection but also builds capacity. It's not a clear-cut distinction, but we can think about, for example, unemployment benefit as a form of social protection, active labour market policy as a form of social investment. But all protection, the most basic investments, are sustaining living standards, and investments provide protection over the long term. So these are not two dimensions that are completely separate. Okay, and then the final thing is that this is linked very much to, and it supports in these economies, the learning economy and the domestic enterprise. And I know Shana is going to talk about, excuse me, some of the challenges for Ireland and where Ireland fits and doesn't fit with the small open economy model. And we do have a foreign investment makes our version quite distinctive. We have a strong relationship to property in the economy and in the society that shapes the nature of our welfare state and so on. So there are tweaks to it, but we do have an element of this model, I think, enough to talk about as a resource. So then, how do we apply this to the public health emergency? If you think about 3 phases in a way, the crisis management right now in terms of the lockdown, then a sense that there will be a period of, and probably quite extended period of uncertainty with not, the testing and tracing and so on, but also quite likely varying restrictions, and that they may ebb and flow, and that there could be quite a deal of uncertainty within economic and social life within that kind of infrastructure. And then hopefully in the longer term, kind of rebuilding towards some kind of new normal, whatever that will be, depending on 2 things in a sense, the public health dimension, but also what we have learned as a society and as an economy and as organizations through the challenges of the next, I don't know, 6 to 18 months, 1 to 2 years, who can be sure. And in a sense, we move in terms of social compensation and the small open economy model from a strong emphasis on protection to, building in a stronger look at investment. So I just wanted to map, in a sense, how the 3 phases of the public health emergency mapped onto the socio-economic recovery. So in terms of crisis management, in terms of the kinds of measures we're talking about, social protection and kind of, in a sense, optimizing capacity on the fly, on the move, like building the ship at sea, basically. There are definite problems with capacity, domestic capacities in areas in Ireland, and in a sense, we're trying to create capacities as we go and provide social protections, not just for workers, but also for firms, for example, with the wage subsidy scheme. What kind of politics? The emphasis is really on, in a way, stability and giving some primacy to expertise, which which it wasn't taken for granted given some of the things we've seen elsewhere. In the next stage, and I'll come back to this in a second, is this period of uncertainty where things start to look better from a public health point of view, but there is great uncertainty in terms of where the society is going, where the economy is going, whether the public health is guaranteed, and so on. And I'll talk some more about that in a second, because I'm starting to run toward the end of my time. And then the third is a kind of a rebuilding towards a new normal, a new kind of, what's the society that succeeds this one. And I mean, we already, although it's somewhat forgotten now, we already had a kind of a seismic general election not so long ago. So there was a sense that the old normal, even though it generated huge increases in employment and so on, had left us with a lot of persistent problems, and also a looming questions around climate change, a Green New Deal, and so on. So we will need to invest our way out of this recession, and we needed to rethink the nature of investment and the direction of investment in terms of challenges like health and housing and so on, but also in terms of the green challenges around climate change and so on. And I think as we move through these, the challenges for politics become more. We will need more from politics rather than less. Simply providing kind of a stable context for experts to operate won't be enough in the sense, we will need from politics, from parliamentary politics, from civil society, some sense of where we go in terms of this new social contract. So I just wanted to end with some comments on this kind of middle phase, and I'm just going to keep this very quick. I think this is a crucial phase where, as we come out of the crisis, there's a sense, I'm not saying we're coming out of it just yet, but as we do come out of it, there's a sense that we will have a window where, institutions have been rejigged, that there will be a window where we have not resettled back into old patterns, where alternative arrangements remain clear. But it's not obvious to me that the same things that we did in the crisis will be the actual best solutions for the next 10 years. But there are 3 kinds of opportunities there. I think that, sectors that actually have experienced significant reconfiguration in the crisis, I read a very interesting set of tweets the other day about an ambulance paramedic and talking about their relationship with doctors and how that had changed. Are we going to learn from that and rejig the institutions, or fall back into existing patterns? Sectors that have been paused, that have been really face very significant efforts to rebuild them. And then the time that's given us a great cost on climate change, whether there is an opportunity there to reset a little bit around green investments and so on. The mechanisms here are really important, I think, which is that this drills down to more than any other stage into the detailed operation of organizations, firms, public organizations, whatever it is. And that has become, clear in the response to the crisis as well, that organizations have had to, at this kind of middle level of the society, reconfigure themselves. And politics plays a key role in kind of pushing this forward, but also facilitating it, building the trust of those in organizations to be able to build on the kind of reconfiguration that we are probably working through right now in the middle of the crisis. Okay, so I think I will I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I will return. It's quite strange talking to your own PowerPoints, and I hope that I wasn't just talking into the void for 15 minutes. But with that, I will, without any further delay, hand over to Shana Cohen for our last presentation.
I'm hoping that I'm going to be able to do this. Is that, I'm hoping that works. Let me know if it doesn't. So I'm Shana Cohen. I'm the director of a think tank called TASC, which is based here in Dublin. It's an independent think tank, and we specialize in democracy and inequality in Ireland and the EU. I wanted to thank you, Sean, for inviting me to participate. So my presentation is going to be a bit more focused on socio-structural issues, and I think it complements the previous two presentations because well, there are particularly 2 points I wanted to draw upon. One was a point that David made, that in SOEs, there's not a lot of room for mistakes, that you have to get things right because you're a small economy dependent on both domestic policy and vulnerable to global events like the one we're experiencing right now. And then Sean talked about the fact that this is going forward, you need a stable environment. Now, one of the issues is going to be correcting whatever the next government looks like, correcting some of the mistakes that have been made policy-wise in the past. And this would be looking at long-term socio-structural trends that, if they're not addressed, could undermine any efforts going forward to try to rebuild the economy. And one way of thinking about these two issues for me is to talk about resilience. And I like this quote by the relatively new governor of the central bank, Gabriel Makhlouf. And he talks about resilience, and I like the concept of resilience, but even before now is being used quite a lot. But he talks about resilience as there's no one-off solution to the challenge of building resilience. It's a continuous process, and it involves individuals, households, businesses, institutions, and authorities. Now, the question beyond the state, which has been a focus today, is what happens with individuals and households, and not just the big businesses like, the high-tech sector here, are the pharmaceutical industry in Ireland, but small and medium-sized enterprises, which actually are the biggest by far employers in Ireland. Okay, so I'm going to just read out, and I hope that you don't mind. I'm going to show you a lot of statistics during the presentation, and they're mostly drawn on TASC research or OECD data. Now, for our inequality report this year, which was done by Rob Sweeney, he talked about low pay. And if you can see, there's Ireland is the third highest rate of low pay in low pay workers in the EU. It's 23% of workers, which is if you think about the crisis we're enduring right now, is a substantial part of the working population, and 23% of wholesale and retail workers and 39% of hospitality workers are low paid. Compared to other countries like Finland, another small European country, this is a high use in these sectors of low paid workers. And if you could think about those industries now being shut down, you think about the consequences to low paid workers. Another issue that's been brought up time and time again in Ireland is the fact that Ireland has a very high market inequality rate, and it's only lowered through cash transfers. So Ireland is actually an outlier compared to other small open economies like the Netherlands in terms of its reliance upon cash transfers to try to reduce the inequality rate. So in addition, as all of us know, living in Ireland, particularly Dublin, is that the cost of living is quite high. And you now have people who may have been laid off, or even if they're not being laid off, they may have had their salary cut. Or even if they haven't had their salary cut, they know that the future of their company may not be that bright, and they are in debt. So Ireland has managed overall, the debt figures have gone down, but then there are particular populations, and again, we're going back to the low pay issue, is that those populations are not financially stable, that the statistics are actually quite high. If you look at 1 in 5, and this is based on a report by Amy Lajoie, who also works for TASC, 1 in 5 households are in debt and feel overburdened by their debt repayments. Over 36% of single parent households, and they're also more reliant on benefits, these households, they're overburdened by debt, and 32% of low income households. If you look at the issue, it's not just mortgage, and that is important to understand, particularly going forward, considering the economic situation right now. A lot of it is based on utilities, just not being able to meet basic needs. And it's also households and work. So going back to the issue raised by David at the beginning in terms of moral hazards, actually one of the problems, the long-term problems that the Irish government will have to deal with going forward is the workers in work don't earn enough. Then they have to ask if the living wage to be phased in over the course of the government, if indeed we do have a new government, is fast enough. So the flip side of that is that there's not a lot of options for savings, and there's not a lot of support for managing debt, particularly for single parent and low income households. Okay. So another issue, as I mentioned earlier, that the new Irish government will have to deal with is the fact that Ireland has an above average percentage of the labor force that's occupied by small and medium-sized enterprises, which is 10 to 249 employees. I'm not counting micro enterprises here, but they have significantly below average levels of value added. And this is both for the EU and OECD. So if you look at just this last year in OECD report, that Irish SMEs represent 99.8% of the total enterprises. And this is not unlike elsewhere in the EU, but it's only 36.6% of value added. And this was a 2015 figure, which is 20% below the EU 28 at that point, was including the UK, average of 56.8%. So you have to, if you look at SOE, if you look at, again, going back to the Netherlands, another SOE, that the output is actually significantly lower because in the Netherlands, 4% of the total number of all enterprises is, in terms of the number of enterprises there are, is as a value added of 40%, versus in Ireland, it's less than 20%. So part of the explanation for the OECD of the lower productivity for SMEs is there's a skills gap. And I think this is quite a long-term structural issue that the Irish government will have to get on top of, not just for lower productivity, but also to widen opportunities, in particular, going back to the populations in low skill, low paid work. At the same time, there's an issue of just developing skills that are quite in need in the construction industry, is just an example. But again, just to give you a few statistics, this is a dated survey. The survey in 2012, and Ireland was in the bottom third of 24 countries for literacy, numeracy, and problem-solving technology. More recently, in 2019, you have that only 10% of people with a low level of education are accessing lifelong learning versus 75% of the people with a third sector education. So third level education. So you can see there's a difference. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to go back to training. And then there's an EU survey, the Digital Economy and Society Index in 2018. 52% of Ireland's population lacks basic sort of skills, and Ireland is one of the lowest shares in terms of 79% of the population using the internet, and that is because Ireland is progressing slower than other countries. Let's say, for instance, Finland and others, a small country. So just to finish up, because to leave time for questions, in terms of policy, rather than focus on the macro level, there'll have to be sort of specific targeted interventions by the government to correct longstanding problems, because they can't, if they're not addressed going forward, then they'll continue to sort of disturb any kind of efforts to rebuild the economy, whether it's 2021 or beyond, particularly because these populations that I'm referring to have been the most hard hit by the crisis. One of the problems from SMEs is that the lack of standards just in general in Ireland, but it's been recommended several times that SMEs need better standards. And this is something that wasn't really mentioned in the framework that came out the past couple of days from the government, that there needs to be legislation to improve standards for SMEs to follow so that they can become more competitive, both within Ireland and globally. The other thing is to avoid siloed policy making. I could tell you that one charity we were working with complained that there are 9 different strategies for the government for dealing with one issue. So coordination across government to target particularly these types of issues would be helpful. It also means closer coordination between policymakers and the frontline agencies like, let's say, MABS, which is helping people with debt. MABS will need to have increased authority and autonomy, and I would say resources, because debt will be a significant issue when the crisis subsides. Another issue that we've found repeatedly in our own work at TASC is local economies. There is mention in the framework about regional development and equalizing development across the country. One of the things that's lacking is sort of a plan for local economic development that's tied to climate action. Now, Ireland was one of the few countries that has not opted into the community development aspect of climate funding at an EU level, and that should change going forward into the next EU budget, that Ireland should be investing in community development as a way to engage in climate action. And this means diversifying rural economies, promoting renewable energy, and so on. We've talked repeatedly about investing in public services and social housing, which would be critical to going forward. Obviously, social housing was a big issue at the last election. Another thing that will be important is for the populations that have experienced the biggest hit from the crisis to be able to have advocates in the public sphere and in the relationship with frontline agencies. And this will mean giving independence and funding to the charity sector, so that those bodies who are protecting low income households or people who've been laid off, regardless of their income, or who are in debt or who have suffered health issues, that they will feel like they have independent advocates that can support them. And again, going back to the point, this will require coordination between charities and the state that is not sometimes worked efficiently, or there's been too distant a relationship, or there's been too much consistent restructuring. And that should change going forward, particularly I would say in relationship to debt and helping people to save, to utilize their income best, but also in terms of the bigger projects of housing. They're going to need support for agencies that are working with domestic violence as well as other issues. Anyway, I'll wind it up here so we can take questions. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I think I've stopped share, Sean.
Okay, thanks very much, Shana. I'm distracted by a whole series of very interesting questions coming in. I think maybe David, we might just get you to, yeah. So what we have is a whole series of questions in the chat. Keep sending them in, and Shana, David, and myself will stay on the video and chat, and then we can kind of discuss these around. I know it's maybe not quite as much interaction with the audience as we might normally get, but it does vastly increase the authority of the chair, which is, good for me, I guess. So there's a lot of very interesting questions here. Let's maybe Let's maybe start with a couple of kind of related to policy, and I just want to start with a quite big one here on climate change. So this has been mentioned a bit. Do we think that there's a chance that urgent issues directly related to the likely recession will get in the way of making big changes for climate change? So just that the trade-off of kind of managing some of the demands around the recession and versus making the big changes for climate change that we need to make. So I don't know, Shane or David, if you want to come in on that.
I would think actually provides an opportunity, because there's a lot to be said for investment in technologies that promote climate action. Also, just engaging the public in climate action. I think that there are a lot of lessons to be learned from the way the government has managed the pandemic in terms of participation in climate action, and taking the moment, because we will actually have reduced carbon emissions, not intentionally, but there's an opportunity here that you were talking about, Sean. There's an opportunity to restructure priorities so that the government can say, well, we're going to invest in these new technologies because they not only create jobs, but they're good for the planet. Mm-hmm. And I think actually there's a great moment for consistent and climate action, but also public education and public participation.
So I broadly agree. I think there is at least a potential for a sweet spot where you can think about framing the crisis recovery, at least from an economic perspective, in a way that positions you for the transition to a lower emissions economy. So there's a lot of talk, obviously, indeed, pre-coronavirus about a Green New Deal in Europe and elsewhere. And perhaps this is a moment, sometimes a crisis, as you said in your remarks, Sean, kind of makes things a bit more fluid and kind of overcome some constraints and barriers that might make that more possible. I think it's also possible, and I underline possible because no one really knows at this stage, that people's attitudes towards sustainability may have changed. The fact that you're not driving in your car every day, the fact you're living in many cases a somewhat simpler life with less emissions, maybe it will persuade people that actually the transition to something a bit different is feasible and within reach, but that remains to be seen in terms of how sustainable those changes in attitudes might be. But the only caveat I suppose I would make is obviously in the short term, and we don't know exactly how long the short term will last for, coronavirus clearly will crowd out almost every other policy issue, right? So the COP26 meeting in Glasgow has been postponed until next year, we hope. Fiscal resources will be tighter than they might otherwise be as we try and dig ourselves out of the economic crisis. And although I think, as you said earlier, Sean, kind of norms have changed around what kind of loose fiscal policy looks like, there still are going to be some constraints about the amount of funding that can be allocated towards these new investments. So I would say there is an opportunity, but I think it's going to require some very clever footwork to figure out how we kind of move from kind of a crisis absorbing all available bandwidth and resourcing to something that's a bit more forward leaning. It won't happen next month. There will be some crowding out, but I think I'm in Shana's camp that, you know, if your horizon is 6 to 12 months plus, that there is an opportunity for us to do something a bit more transformational, if I can use that word.
I just add before I go on, I mean, I agree with all of that. I think the reason that I emphasize that middle stage is I think that there's a huge, sometimes when we think about these massive directional shifts in a society and the economy, we kind of think we can make them, you know, in one big shift. But I think a lot of it really depends on how we embed that in the everyday workings of, you know, of different kinds of organizations. So like if you take healthcare, for example, lots of different things will have happened in healthcare, but, you know, so that possibility is there, but until you kind of embed them in a way that's sustainable beyond the crisis, you're probably going to tend to fall back on where you were before unless you try to build this in. And I do think with the climate that's where, at some level, I mean, just because we need to do this doesn't mean it will happen, but at some level you would think that, you know, we will have to invest our way out of this at some stage. So there will be major public and private investments at some stage, and are we going to be, you know, will we have thought through what those are going to be, or is it going to be crisis management up until we pile a load of money in and then, you know, we pile it into the same stuff we would have piled it into before? Now,
the only additional remark that I might make, if I may, is I think coronavirus and kind of this notion that we are more exposed to pandemics, global pandemics, than perhaps we had imagined, at least outside the expert community, even 2 or 3 months back, might also contribute to a broader awareness that there are a series of these other risks, climate change among them, that we also need to invest in to manage, to build resilience. So it might mean that the way that policymakers are thinking, the way that voting populations are thinking about these issues, the time horizon extends a bit, and there is a greater awareness that we do need to make some investments to build resilience against pandemics, climate change, and the like. So hopefully these efforts are complementary.
Right. I'm getting kind of questions around kind of particular measures and policy issues, but then also around kind of the politics of it. So I'm going to maybe park the politics a little bit for now and come to that in maybe about 10 minutes. So, but maybe stay on some of the kind of issues that have come in. And there's one here really interesting one about gender, posed to Shana, but I think for probably relevant to all of us. A gender analysis of active labour market policy after the financial crash showed that men were primary beneficiaries of spending on active labour market policies, like programs like apprenticeships and so on. So do we have a sense of what a gender-proofed and low-carbon active labour market policy would look like? In other words, how do we build kind of gender-proofing into that stage of kind of reinvention? I might maybe start with you on that, Shana, if it's okay.
I think that's a good question, because it could be that the female-led single-parent households are the hardest hit by this. There's also sort of the question of a two-tier welfare system right now, that the payments being made to workers are higher than the regular payments. So let's say there is a new government, if the care economy is taken seriously, then that should be something, if it's taken seriously in the fact that workers are paid properly, that childcare is adequately invested in. And childcare, not just because it's a career destination, for often it's a career destination, or it's a job primarily taken by women, but also because women need childcare in order to enter the workforce. I think anything that is in any investment in state subsidized childcare and not leaving it up to the private sector will help, particularly women who are in middle or lower income families. I also think beyond the care economy that there does need to be more support for single parent households, just in general. I think in terms of access to services and access to, again, going back to there aren't many options compared to other countries for support for debt, household debt, and so you end up going to money lenders whom I think I'm not sure if there's any data at all about how money lenders are doing right now, but it could be that they're doing quite well, and that's not a good thing. So the state needs to offer more options, particularly to households that are dependent on welfare, which are often female-led.
Oh, David, did you want to?
So I'll only offer a couple of very brief remarks, and this is a little bit outside my area of expertise, but one is to echo the point that Shana made, I think, which is that the people who have been most affected directly by coronavirus and the like are people who perhaps haven't been as visible to the mass population as previously. And more people now have experience with trying to work and to look after kids, are realizing the difficulties, are realizing the financial stresses. So perhaps that does give some confidence that when we redesign these programs back post-crisis, that we've done so in a slightly different, slightly more broadly based way than has been the case. And a second observation I would make, although I don't have data to hand, is that the way in which active labour market policy runs in, for example, many of the Nordic countries or Netherlands or other Northern European countries, to my understanding at least, is done in a way that is a bit more gender neutral. At least the gender outcomes aren't as as unequal as is perhaps the case in some kind of Anglo countries. So I think there are lessons for Ireland and for others to learn from that Nordic and Northern European experience.
I do think there's we see it actually with a lot of our own students, just the challenges that they're facing around care, and it really exposes how reliant we are on family relationships for care, and local neighbours and so on. And once those get cut off, and I mean the family, we're on kind of in a way borrowed time with that kind of so-called solution, because in a sense we're moving more towards a kind of a sandwich generation anyway. But this reliance on grandparents and so on, at a time that grandparents are explicitly, you know, banned from providing that help, is a massive issue. And you can see, like, I just see it with our own students. There's various issues. There's financial issues. There's IT. You know, there's a kind of infrastructure of everyday life stuff. And then the other thing that's really, really big is care. And I see a comment in there. Care is a big neglected issue of the crisis, and I think that is really, you know, and a lot of that is quite hidden because we're not seeing what's going on with, you know, we just get kind of a peek into what's going on around the society in different ways. So we know that is out there, and I think, you know, that is a major challenge that will, you know, you don't have to have an extreme challenge like this public health crisis for these care issues to be just a massive ongoing issue. And that is very interesting, because let's say that we said, okay, the whole childcare system is now becoming public. There was a deal done. I mean, that's a kind of case where you would have to say, well, you know, what's the management structure? What's the industrial relations? Or what's the, you know, does this build into the pay structures, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, that would be a huge step, in my view, a very beneficial step. But you know, there will be an awful lot to be worked out along the way to that. There's one other on the policy side before we get on to kind of the political institutions and political dynamics, and I suppose it's a question, you know, around, it says, what should the policy response to weak management practices in small and medium-sized enterprises be, or, you know, more generally, even just you know, as a small open economy, I suppose most other small open economies, the domestic enterprise is a big driver of economic recovery and so on, and of economic dynamics. And yet, you know, Ireland, because of the reliance on foreign investment and so on, has a weaker SME sector that is getting, certainly on the kind of local economies and so on, seems to be absolutely decimated by the current crisis. So, you know, what can we do on that side, and what needs to be done, and how can it be done?
Perhaps I'll just offer a few thoughts. And the opening thought, I suppose, is this is by no means unique to Ireland. In many small countries, the SMEs are well away from a productivity frontier. They have issues around management capability. Many of them have issues with growth and the like. You know, there are some things that governments can do in a hands-on way. So the various economic development organisations, both at national and regional level, in a very hands-on way, these can be useful, although they're difficult to scale. You know, the quality of management and business training in formal educational institutions, business schools, if you like, also makes a difference. But I think, you know, those things all do play a role, as do business institutions and the like. But I guess I would also point, and you alluded to this, Sean, in your introduction just now, the structure of the economy and economic behaviour also plays a really important role. And one of the things that you see around the world in both large and small economies is that the degree of competitive intensity that you face creates an incentive to upgrade, to figure out how you beat your competition, how you maintain market share. And if you like, you're facing pressure to kind of upgrade, to think things through. Not always a pleasant process, and not everyone will succeed. But thinking through, you know, do we have that kind of competitive intensity across the economy? Are there some things that could be done, for example, around competition policy, around, you know, whether markets are functioning? So that would be one. I think the second, and this is perhaps a little bit more Ireland specific, is the role of MNCs in the economy. And the degree to which they act as a giant sucking sound, if you like, you know, attracting you know, talent, management talent in this case, to work for them, because in general they will offer high wages, good terms and conditions. It's a good thing to have on your CV. So if you're coming out of university, or you're a middle manager, and you get an opportunity to work for Apple or a pharmaceutical company, you know, in a sense, it's low risk, often high reward. And as a consequence, and you see this in other high FDI intensity economies in Singapore that I'm most familiar with, where you see a very similar phenomenon where the SME sector in Singapore is fairly small. They haven't grown outside of a state-owned sector, the Singapore Airlines of the world. But they haven't grown that many kind of indigenous manufacturing firms. You know, that's partly because the management capability, as well as the underlying cost structure, becomes challenging for these SMEs to operate in. So, again, I'm not recommending that kind of overnight you get rid of the MNCs, because they do make a significant contribution, at least at the moment. But there are some issues in terms of how do you allocate talent, so to speak, across different sectors of the economy, and what sort of incentives are you creating? The positive spin of that is that we know that large firms, including MNCs, are a useful sort of apprenticeship device. You learn a lot on the job. So formal education institutions are important, but a lot of the learning, particularly around management skills, happens on the job. And if you're working in a large, well-structured, well-resourced organization, often you learn quite quickly. And then the issue comes around, is that knowledge diffused? Is there kind of interplay between workers in MNCs and elsewhere? Is there a kind of a process by which that, those sort of management capabilities and practices get diffused out into SMEs and the economy? And that might not necessarily be people leaving the employment and moving somewhere else, as much as you're working together, you're working in supply chains together. And so do you see that degree of interaction? Or is it the case, as I understand it has been in Ireland, where you kind of have the MNC sector over here, and you have the indigenous SME sector over here, and the links between them are somewhat tenuous. So I think a large part of the answer, in addition to the obvious kind of working with firms to build capability, is around thinking through some of those structural issues, and particularly the interplay between MNCs and SMEs.
Thanks, David. Shana, and I noticed there's a lot of questions in around employment. I'll summarize them afterwards, but if you wanted to address that along the way.
No, I did. You could go ahead and take the next questions. I would echo everything David said. It's particularly the relationship between SMEs and the MNCs, and the fact that a lot of the talent goes to MNCs, that SMEs can't compete in terms of salaries and benefits.
Okay, because there's a few, I might just read them in a sense as comments, and because I want to leave at least 10 minutes just to talk about the political and institutional stuff, but just a few comments coming in that I think in a way fit together, and are maybe the flip side of the connection between that kind of enterprise side and the kind of things that you were talking about, Shana, around precarious work and so on. And in a sense, in a sense, maybe my own perspective would be, if you solve some, or if you start to address some of the labor market and precarious employment issues, you also start to generate a kind of a pressure, a kind of beneficial constraints on employers that you have to move up. I mean, you have to give tools to do that, but you also kind of have to move up. But there's a few just interesting comments here that I might read out before we go on. One is just about the high incidence of low pay and wage inequality, and how it poses a structural dilemma for the small open economy, because it narrows the tax base. Low pay, it creates this dynamic where there's low tax capacity and narrow tax base, but also heavy demand for redistribution. And then that's one of the drivers behind the kind of cash transfer welfare state rather than the services welfare state. So that's a kind of a feature in the sense that you might say is to do with the welfare state, but actually is driven in some ways through the private labor market. Another comment about if lifelong learning and skill development are key to building resilience, that this should be the norm, not just for kind of higher skilled, high earners, but also for lower earning workers in more precarious positions. And how can the active labor market policy address this, especially for people in precarious positions, and for firms that are actually fairly, I suppose, thin organizationally, that there can be a challenge there for their capacity to take that on. And just another comment before I move on is just about in a way there's different issues coming up about how to address these questions around the intersection of low pay, insecurity, and the capacities of SMEs. And is there a unique policy window here to campaign for a real living wage, especially around the public solidarity around the reliance on low paid workers in supermarkets, retail, healthcare, etc. So there's a lot of different issues there that I think we've touched on along the way, but there's also a bunch of questions around the kind of political dynamics and the kind of institutions and the kind of domestic capacity that is available. So I just wanted to make sure to get to at least three of those. one, so one is around the kind of the state model, the model of the state that we have. Another is around kind of social dialogue, social partnership, and so on. And the third is around kind of picking up on that last point there, the reconfiguration of kind of the class dynamics of politics, really, with the kind of the new importance given to essential workers who, a month ago were seen as relatively low status. So just to take the first one around the capacity of the state, to what extent is Ireland's kind of central state model, relatively centralized, weak municipalities and so on, relatively weak local authorities, most spending through the central state. To what extent is it, a resource? To what extent is it a weakness? And is there an appetite, in the central state to actually rebalance and reconstruct rather than just restore back to where we were? So just a small question there. So I don't know who wants to start.
I could try. That is a big question. I think that going forward, there needs to be more decentralization of authority. I think that the government is too centralized in Ireland for the scope of the challenges that lie ahead. Because, the pandemic, as a number of people have said, could be a dry run for a climate change, for a climate catastrophe. And it's not going to come from Dublin, the solutions. If you look at the UK, which Ireland has in the past often done, so there is a devolution of authority to make, so there are greater decision-making power at a regional level, and I think that is important moving forward. Also, trust will be really critical. I think trust that the government is acting on the public's behalf and not just sort of, the model in the past has been oriented toward MNCs, corporate tax rate, Dublin, and it has ignored a lot of, there's been insufficient policy intervention with issues that are related to, let's say, the bottom 50% of income earners in the population. And I think that from the health system to education to the reliance on cash transfers and some of the language about being on welfare, there'll need to be a change, but I don't think the central government will be the place. I think centralized authority will only get us so far.
Can I just offer a slightly counter point to that, which is, I guess from outside looking into Ireland, Ireland is a small country. I mean, by definition, it's sort of 5 million people, give or take. Yes, it is reasonably centralized, but so too some others, New Zealand, Singapore, which is a city-state, so a different context. I think, whereas on the other hand, you have the Nordic economies who tend to be very, very heavily decentralized, I would say to a fault. Right, they have hundreds of municipalities, lots of duplication and the like. So a lot of the debate that you see in Nordics is how do we kind of lift the centre of gravity up towards the centre, not completely. So to me, there is no perfect answer to this because context matters enormously. I think it essentially boils down to an issue about where does state capacity lie? We know how much capacity do you have? And simply lowering the centre of decision-making gravity, unless you've got capacity at lower levels of government, which you may well do, I don't know. It can lead to poor quality decision-making and fragmentation. So I guess I would approach it with a degree of caution and care, and with a real sense of what problem is it that you are trying to solve. So I absolutely take Shana's point that many countries you have kind of capital city-centric policy, in your case, Dublin, and sometimes other regions aren't given their policy due. But simply moving to a more decentralized model of governance in what is already a fairly small jurisdiction may end up being a costly way of solving that problem. So I guess I would encourage you to think about sort of striking the balance appropriately. And I think, as I mentioned, there are a bunch of other small economy models out there with national populations about the size of Ireland, and figuring out what are the strengths and weaknesses of different approaches to that, I think would be a useful way of kind of framing that debate.
I think there is an interesting question, and we actually don't know, I think, a huge amount about how it really works, at least kind of publicly, but is, there's the question of the central national state and subnational states and so on. But there is also the question of how the national state operates. So, you know, in a sense, the kind of core of the national state is often quite internally centralized, like quite hierarchical, you know, that in a sense, and perhaps this is just a legacy that has become built in, you know, of personalism that has become built into bureaucracies. But a lot of the time, you know, you can say it's that person who is the person who is everything runs through on X, you know, and I mean, I know that the public service has been trying to, or parts of it anyway, have been kind of pushing that out, and this is partly why you get the new agencies set up to kind of work around that and so on. So, but I do think that is a question we're thinking about how the kind of central authority model, this kind of vertical model of organization, can actually, you know, even separately from the kind of national versus local question, be you know, transformed into something a bit more dialogical, which takes me on to the last question, I suppose, and probably the last question of time for, which is around the prospects around social partners. And there's, you know, been actually quite intensive real social dialogue with ICTU, IBEC and government in the past month around, you know, unprecedented suite of income and job supports, linking enterprise and labour issues. How confident will we be that when we exit the emergency, the role of the social partners in policy would move more towards the norm in small open economies? Obviously, we had social partnership for many years, but in a sense, you know, it has kind of been greatly weakened in the same, you know, it didn't not institutionalized or embedded in the same way that it would be in many of the other small open economies. So where will social dialogue go after after this crisis? So I don't know who wants to take that one on.
I could just briefly. I think it's a big question mark. I hope it there continues to be a move toward sort of, well, I'm glad to hear that there's social dialogue, but I hope that there, with the idea of promoting the living wage and the attention paid to low wage workers, that there'll be a respect for the role that unions can play in protecting worker rights, including like paid sick leave and opportunities for promotion. And in the sectors like hospitality and retail that have been hit, but you don't want to allow them to use wages as a way to get back on their feet. I'd hope that that would be a consequence of what's going on right now, but I won't hold my breath. Not to be cynical, but I don't know. I don't know that that would happen, considering the relatively weak bargaining rights in Ireland.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I'm not well placed to offer a particularly informed point of view about prospects of social dialogue in Ireland. I guess I would only say, as an outsider, Ireland strikes me as having a very Anglo-oriented set of economic policies and institutions. As even among small economies, you know, there's a kind of a Northern European or continental model. I mean, there's you know, the islands and the New Zealands who run very kind of Anglo-style policy, and also often have economic models that are characterized by reasonably low wage, reasonably low skill and investment, and low productivity outcomes, at least in parts of their economy, in Ireland's case, outside of the MNC sector. And there are ongoing conversations around the, you know, particularly, and this is where, getting back to coronavirus, there might be a shock to the system where, you know, migration flows, for example, might be constrained going forward. And so the reliance of kind of abundant foreign labour, which among other things, although it fills skills gaps, will often have a depressing effect on wages. In the low skill part of the community, it might mean that, you know, if there's a short or enduring sharp shock to that part of the economy, it might force some conversations about how do you transition from the current equilibrium, if you like, to something that is more reliant on investing, on upskilling, on higher wages, and a higher productivity model. In a sense, that doesn't necessarily need a social dialogue model to go alongside it, although it would be helpful, I think. But I think one of the structural issues that might come out of coronavirus, particularly if it endures for a period of time before we return to anything approaching normality, might be some real question marks in Anglo countries like Ireland, like New Zealand, about the way we run our economies, in the way we think about skills, wages, unions, and so on.
Yeah, I think we do have to, there's quite a kind of a significant rethinking that's required in that lower pay end of the labour market, because in a way our policy system is set up to you know, not necessarily to enable it, but it ends up enabling it by trying to accommodate it with the structure of welfare payments, the low tax wage for employers and so on, low social security contributions of employers. That's a big, you know, it's a big gap in our tax structure. So, but to, you know, they just dump that all on what are in some cases quite, you know, not exactly, these are not necessarily employers who are living high in the hog. You know, you have to actually link that up to enterprise policy as well. But again, this is a, you know, there's going to be a lot of firms that are going to be just hanging on or, you know, reconstituting themselves and so on. And I think there is an opportunity there to try and like build out some of the things we learned in enterprise policy kind of at the higher end of the economy, and, you know, try and apply some of that, you know, productivity and good conditions and training and all of that matters through the whole economy, not just in the export sector. But listen, I see it's just gone 1 o'clock. I know some of the speakers are under a bit of time pressure, but also I know some people in terms of the guests and the participants. Thanks for all the great questions. I think we got to most of them, if only to be mentioned rather than to be discussed. I hope that it has been interesting. There will be a recording in some form available afterwards, and we have to figure out exactly how that will work, but there will be a recording, and Shane and my own presentations will be available. And as David said, you can check out a lot of his work on the website and on his Twitter. So I think maybe it's a little strange signing off with, I have no idea whether everybody's already left or whether everybody is clamoring for more, but I want to thank everyone for participating. Special thanks to Shana and to David, and to everybody who participated, and a huge thanks to Philip and Susan and all the organizers over at Gear.